Hi everybody, welcome to our live video about comb honey. It's a little early on to be thinking about harvesting honey, but if you want to try foundationless beekeeping or harvesting honeycomb, now's the time to start thinking about it, because you're going to want to buy the supplies, set your frames up a certain way when you have your bees. And I just finished filming and just started the editing to a video about essentially doing an autopsy on your hive if they did not survive the winter, so that if you are coming to the end of winter and finding that your bees have not survived, or what we call a dead out, ways that you can figure out what the cause was, so that you can hopefully prevent it next time. And also very important, if it was something that caused the death, like a fungus, like nosema, you want to make sure that you do not reuse that comb. It's really important to not spread that to healthy hives. So feel free to post questions down in the comments section or comments, and I'll get to them as I can. But for now, I'm going to start just talking. All right, this is all about foundationless beekeeping. Foundationless beekeeping is the practice of taking care of your hive with no foundation in it. If you have a top bar hive, most likely you are foundationless. But for those of you with the typical Langstroth style beehive, you have the option to put foundation in your frames. So find my frame here. Your frames are going to look like this. If you're a beginner, it's not going to have wax stuck to it. But bees prefer these grungy old equipment. Just need to make sure you put it in a freezer, freeze it, or just really scrape it and clean it before you put it into a beehive. But bees love old equipment that smells like bees and wax. So you have your frames if you're using a Langstroth style beehive, and most beekeepers, or it tends to be common practice, is to put foundation inside your frames. Deep frames, shallow frames, medium-sized frames, doesn't matter the size frame, but most people put foundation in. A foundation is can be made of plastic or beeswax, and it has the hexagon imprint on it like honeycomb, but it's not the depth of honeycomb, so it just has a tiny little groove in there, and then the bees build honeycomb off of it. If you have the flow hive, the key to the flow, like the big flow invention, is that they actually didn't just build foundation, but they built the whole comb. So if you have a flow hive, you're not using foundation, you're just using their flow frames, and there's no need for foundation. The whole cell is there, and that's how you harvest honey without having to pull the frame out. It like shifts the cells. So here's a plastic foundation. It's pretty beat up, but here is beeswax foundation. I've never actually put beeswax foundation into a hive. I've used plastic foundation plenty of times. Farms I worked for all use plastic foundation. Beeswax foundation I really just have for when I was rolling candles. It's a really easy beeswax candle you can make. So when you go foundationless, you're not putting either of these foundations in your hive. You're putting an empty frame in and allowing the bees to build their own comb. And you can do this in, your top bar hives, your Langstroth style hives, assuming other style beehives, most of them, except for if you have a flow hive and you want to harvest using the flow technology that allows you to harvest without pulling your frames out, you cannot go foundationless for those parts. You can put a couple of foundationless frames into any beehive that holds a frame like this. You can have all flow frames except for one, and then put two of these guys in there. You can have all foundation frames in your hive except for just one frame has no foundation. You can try it in such a small way. It doesn't have to be the entire beehive is one way or the other. So the benefits of not using foundation versus foundation is, Obviously, one, you're saving a little bit of money because it's an extra piece of equipment you need to buy. Two is it can save time. I mean, these pieces of foundation, minimum amount of time to put this. Your frame should have grooves in them. Let me see if I can. So right here is like a groove, and you really just put your foundation in that groove and pop it in, because these plastic sheets can bend. Or you can put it in when you're assembling it, would be the easiest way. And then you have your foundation in. You can also buy frames with plastic foundation built into them. I do not recommend these because small hive beetles, there's just lots of crevices in those plastic frames for the small hive beetle to hide in. If you live in colder climates, not a big deal because your small hive beetle population is low, but in warmer climates, climates where you have a lot of fruit trees, that's where small hive beetles population gets really high, and you're going to want to do whatever you can to keep them from hanging out in your beehive. The other benefit to foundationless beekeeping is that you can harvest comb honey, which is something that I harvest, and I'll talk a little bit later about how to do that and what you do with comb honey. Another benefit to foundationless beekeeping, if you use it in the brood section, is that when you don't have foundation in there, you can cut through. The benefit to that is if you try queen rearing and you say have a hive that's really great and you want to breed from that hive, you want all your beehives to be just like that beehive, you can take the queen out of that hive and you can allow them to make a whole bunch of queen cells. Now, when you have a frame with a whole bunch of queen cells, once they get to the point that they're capped already and a little bit larger, but a few days before they would be hatching, you can just take a sharp knife and cut the queen cells out. Now, you want to leave a little bit of space around it, not cut too tightly, but you could cut a bunch of queen cells out and just push them into a brood frame in another beehive, like a whole bunch of nukes you could make. And it's an easy way to rear queens without having to graft eggs and all that stuff. If you are looking to introduce a new queen to a hive, I highly recommend push cages. I have a video about push cages on my YouTube channel. Really easy to make out of hardware cloth. And when you push the cage onto your brood frame, you release the queen into this cage. It's a good size, like 5 inches by 5 inches. She starts laying eggs almost immediately. The bees take to her a lot faster. And what I found is the bees release her naturally because they just eat through the wax. By the time they've eaten through the wax and released her, they have already accepted her. I have never had a hive not accept a queen when I've used a push cage. And so you can't do that with foundation because the bees can never chew through the plastic foundation to get to her. They can only chew through the wax. If you are looking to cut out your drone comb because you want to freeze it for dealing with varroa mites to bring your varroa mite levels down, you can always just take a knife and cut out those little drone sections and leave the rest. And you can't do that if there's foundation. Well, that's really not an option. When you use foundation, you need to use drone comb. You can't just put this regular worker bee size cells in there. You need also drone foundation. But you can just pull out the drone cells as they make them. Now, for pest management, for varroa mite management, some people think that allowing the bees to build their smaller cell sizes helps with varroa mite management. It means that when the cell size is smaller, it takes the bees less time to go through the full development before they hatch, which gives the varroa mites less time to have their babies inside those cells. And so some people allow their bees to make smaller cells with foundationless beekeeping. You can also buy smaller cell foundation if you like, if you want to try that out for bringing your cell size down. When I interviewed Michael Bush for my podcast, that was one thing that he did. He also sliced down his frames so they were a little bit narrower so he could fit 11 frames in a 10 frame box, and allowed the bees to build their own cell size. And he said that was key to being treatment-free beekeeping and allowing the bees to build their smaller cell sizes. I haven't tried it yet because with 2 little kids running around, I just don't have the time to pull out the table saw and start slicing down my frames. But that's what he says that he does. If you want to harvest beeswax for body products or candles, it is a lot easier to harvest the wax when there's no foundation in there. You just, cut it out and melt it down. If you have foundation, you're going to want to put it in the sun to soften it up and then have to scrape it off. And a lot of wax is going to get left on the foundation. Also, now I can't say bees like it because I don't know that for a fact, but I will say that whenever I have frames with no foundation in them, along with frames with foundation, the bees always build out the frames with no foundation first. Always, always, always. I've really had some trouble getting bees to take to the flow hive frames. They will during a big nectar season, but if there's not a ton going on, they've literally bypassed the flow box and gone to the box above it and built that out and completely deserted the flow box. I've had bees only take to the empty frames and totally leave the frames with foundation. And there's tricks you can brush some wax on your foundation to encourage the bees to take to it. And I have waxed foundation. I also have frames with drawn out comb, but they still take to the empty frames and make their own fresh beeswax. And you're just letting the bees build the cell size that they want. Maybe they don't want all of their cells the exact same size. We don't know what they want. Maybe they don't have a preference either, but it's always nice to just not control so much of their hive. We're controlling where their home is, how big it is. Like we're introducing queens. We're deciding quite a bit. We're deciding how much honey they get to eat. I think it's nice to let them build their own comb, the size and shape and everything that they want. And you'll see that there's just a lot of variation to the cells when the bees can make their own cell size. All right, so my experience with it. Now, when I first started my apiary here, when I kept bees in Pennsylvania, I had top bar hives. So I was foundationless because I just had bars. It was a typical top bar that had the slanted sides. And so I didn't have frames in my hive. Then I worked for an apiary and they used typical Langstroth style hives with frames with plastic foundation. And they had a room that was air conditioned. And so when the frames were emptied during a harvest or after a harvest, they would throw it in the air conditioning room because that was enough to keep insects from eating it, and it kept it away from rodents. And then they would just throw those empty frames of honeycomb that were spun back into the beehive for the next harvest season. Their wax was like so dark, so caked on with propolis. It was like you tried to bend it, it would just make this creaking, cracking noise. Now, when I decided that I wanted to start having some of my own beehives because I wanted to try new things, and I wasn't going to be able to do that for the company I worked for. I was also living in a studio apartment, and I wasn't making a lot of money at this job. So I just used no foundation. This allowed me to harvest honey without needing an extractor, which is large and just another big expense when beekeeping. And The owner of the apiary I was working for said that she was often getting calls from resorts and stuff in the area looking for comb honey. And that was something that her husband, the head beekeeper, had absolutely no interest in doing. So she said if I did harvest comb honey, she would buy it. So that gave me, a client. And how I did it. So I'm going to first show you how I did foundationless beekeeping, and then I'll show you some other options if you want to try them as well. I I can be so lazy sometimes. I I like to try with the minimal, like most minimalist possible, and then work my way up from there. So I just put this in, like just totally empty frame into the beehive. Now a lot of people don't want to do that because they're afraid that there's going to be cross comb, and that's when that's when bees build comb on a frame, and then it starts to do this diagonal and it connects to the next frame, which makes it really hard to pull the frame out of the beehive. You are going to have to rip the comb. um, but what I found is that if your hive is totally level, I mean totally level, not just putting your cell phone on the hive and checking, but making sure the hive is level, and you put 10 frames in your 10 frame box, so there's no extra gaps. 8 frame box, you have 8 frames in there. The bees would not build cross comb. Now, every once in a while, a beehive still would build cross comb, and what I did to just extra to prevent cross comb in all of my beehives was I would take a couple frames that already were drawn out. So, like, just to make sure you guys know that I actually know how to do this, I have proof of my foundationless frame, because it's what you're going to see is some gaps where they didn't fully connect it to the frame. I would put a few frames that were like this, or they didn't have to have honey in them. They didn't have to be completely drawn out, but they had comb in them, preferably drawn out at least for half of the frame. And I would put them in between the frames that were empty. So, when you have your box, you're going to put an empty frame in there first because it's next to the wall. So, put an empty frame in or two, then you'll put in a frame with drawn out comb or a honey frame, and then you'll put in another couple of empty frames, then another frame of drawn out comb, and then some more empty frames. And at the very least, if you do have some cross comb, it's going to stop at the frames that are in there that are already drawn out. So you have these walls to prevent the cross comb from going across the entire box. If you don't have frames of drawn out comb, you can put in frames of foundation in between to as another guide. But I usually just put frames with no foundation that are drawn out in between. I also have a chest freezer, so it's an easy way to be able to do this. I don't buy a lot of beekeeping gadgets or equipment, but the chest freezer is one of those things that I got very early on, just like the 3 cubic foot one, a really small one, and has been invaluable. And that's here in a warm climate. But for you guys that have and are in cold climates and you need to store some empty comb so that you can give it to the bees come spring, this is a super easy way to do it. Easy way to freeze your frames before you put them in the hive come spring that were getting chewed up by wax moth and stuff, because you have frames that look like this and you can sit there and scrape them all if you want to, but if you could just throw them in a freezer, it makes life a lot easier. So that's what I did, those 3 things. Hives totally level, no gaps in between the frames. You have 10 frames in your 10 frame box, and you put in a couple of frames with drawn out comb, ideally at like 4, so that it's every other-ish frame. And then one person said you just have to keep monitoring it for cross combing. You can, but I have a lot of hives and I'm not going to go through all of the supers. So this is an easy way to make sure that it doesn't happen without having to monitor it. Like you're going on vacation or whatever. you have a big nectar season and the bees are filling up a box in under a month, if your hive is level and you have no gaps in between your frames, you're almost guaranteeing that you're not going to have cross comb. But if you do have cross comb, what you want to do is, say you have some honeycomb in there and then it's turning like this. What you want to do is just cut it so that you can get the frame out. You're going to cut the comb at the top where it hits the top bar and the bottom at the point that it starts to turn. And you're just going to very gently push it so that it's straight again. And then you're going to take your rubber band and you're going to put as many rubber bands as you need to around this comb so that it is straight. Now, some comb might break and fall out, so you can just have comb floating in there. It doesn't have to even be attached to the bars. And you put as many rubber bands as you need to in there. It helps to have an extra set of hands, but it is possible to do this on your own. And what the bees will do is they will reattach it to the frame, and sometimes they'll chew the rubber band. Sometimes they'll build the rubber band into the comb. And they're not a fan of the rubber bands. I mean, you could take them out later on if you want to, and just fix it that way. So, you don't have to make the whole hive foundationless. You can do a couple frames in the brood section to see how it goes. You can do a couple frames in a honey super to see how it goes. And just try it in a small way like that first. So if you want to go foundationless and you don't want to put an empty frame in there, other options are to take a thin piece of wood like a popsicle stick and you're going to put it in the groove right here, and then you're going to drizzle some melted beeswax in there with the popsicle stick so that it gives people think that it helps to give the bees that extra little lip. That's a guide to help the bees build their comb in that straight line. When using wax, just make sure you're using, the beeswax that wasn't in your hive when you were treating, ideally. And that's another option. Once the bees have already, you have frames that have already had comb built in them. I mean, this frame already kind of has a guideline under here already. It's very thin, but bees are small also, so it's already a guide. And then there's also wire. Some people will put wire horizontally across the frames. I've usually seen two. I've seen it in the apiaries I've worked at, but I've never actually done it myself. It just seemed like a lot of extra work, and I didn't have a reason to do it because I didn't have problems doing foundationless beekeeping myself. Now, some problems some people have had other than cross comb is that they say they have a lot of drone comb in their hive because you're letting the bees build cells whatever size they want to, which might be smaller cells and you might have some smaller bees coming out, but you also might have a lot of drone comb. Now, personally, I just let it. I just let it go. I mean, if I was running some big honey company and every hive was, another $1,000 that I was making, yeah, okay, or however much money you make from the honey in each beehive, maybe then you would care a little bit more. But when the varroa mites are in your hive, most of them, over 90% of the varroa mites are going to be in those pupating cells. The females are going in there, they're laying eggs. Those babies are, while the bee is still pupating, the mite's going to lay eggs, the eggs are going to hatch, they're going to mate with their brothers and sisters in that cell, and they're all feeding off of these drones, and they go to the drone cells because the drones take the longest to pupate. So when your hive has a lot of varroa mites, and say it's a time of year, like especially for me, if it's a time of year when I do not want to treat like summertime, when there's a lot of honey coming in, a way to bring down your varroa mite levels is to get rid of all of that drone comb. Now, some people just do it year round to keep varroa mite levels low. But at the very least, if your levels are high, you can get rid of a lot of drone comb. And so some theories are that bees build more drone comb as a way to trap these mites, because then some hives are a little bit more likely to, more inclined to go into those cells and remove those pupating bees, and that's how they keep their mite levels low naturally on their own. So it can be good to allow the bees to build drone cells, sometimes more than you'd like to see, but it might be better for their health. I am not an entomologist. I have not done research on this versus not using drone cells. I do know that I've talked to Randy Oliver at Scientific Beekeeping. He is a biologist that does a lot of testing on his bees about varroa mite management. I highly recommend checking out his website, scientificbeekeeping.com. And his way to looking at the varroa mite management is that you want to breed the colonies that deal with mites on their own without the beekeeper's intervention. And it's really hard to see how well a beehive is doing managing varroa mites on their own if you're taking out their drone comb. But it's really up to you whether you want to try that or not. So personally, I think letting the bees make a bunch of drone comb sometimes is okay. And then in the summertime, when you're pulling out that drone comb, that just frees up space for the bees to build more comb that can prevent swarming. So if you don't want to split hives, you don't want more hives in your apiary, an easy way to just free up space is to just cut out all of that drone comb that you're seeing. And when you do foundationless beekeeping, you're going to see a section of drone comb and then a section of worker bee cells, or a section of drone comb along on a honey frame. I rarely see an entire frame just for drone comb. So then when you have the wire in there, that makes it a whole lot easier to cut the wax with that wire in the way. So going foundationless in the brood boxes is maybe for varroa mite management or to help with queen rearing. Foundationless in honey boxes is for harvesting comb honey. Now, if you have an extractor and you're just going to be putting all your frames in the extractor, I don't recommend going foundationless unless you're going to put wire in there, because your frames, they just don't have that extra support. So I would definitely just put a plastic sheet in there or some wire for your extractor to spin it, especially if you live somewhere where it gets really warm in the summer. In the heat, that wax gets really soft and it can just flop over. And you can, run your extractor not so fast and stuff, but I mean, they go really fast. So unless you have an extractor and you're really good at managing the speed of it, you're probably going to break a lot of comb using foundationless frames in your extractor. Which brings me actually to one more thing I forgot that's a downside to you going foundationless, is that your frames don't have that extra support in the heat when the wax is a lot softer. So a few, rookie mistakes I've made is that I've had these gorgeous frames of, honey look like this, and I'm like, oh great, this is perfect. And then I take it out of the hive, I lean it up against the hive, go to do something else, and then I look over and the thing is just flopped over and it's just a giant pile of mush in the grass. So they're just a lot more fragile, the frames with comb that do not have the foundation in them or the wire. So just you have to be a lot more careful with them. So when harvesting comb honey, what you want to do is you just take so first you want to freeze the comb. You can freeze it when you first take it out of the beehive, or you can freeze it once it's been harvested. If you have a chest freezer, freezing it when it first comes out of the beehive is the easiest, in my opinion. And then you want it, I just take a sharp bread knife and I cut it up into sections. I put it on a large, pan like this. Restaurant supply sites have some really great big pans that you can use. And then when you cut the comb, if you're going to put it in a container like this one, these boxes, you're going to want to then put it on a wire rack to let the honey drip out. I mean, it's not absolutely necessary, but otherwise you're going to have a lot of liquid honey in there. Some people like the look of that. I am shipping the honey, and so since we are in Hawaii, it almost all the time when I ship honey, it's going on a plane and it's being shipped, pretty far. So the less liquid honey that's in these boxes, the better, in my opinion. You can also put it in jars with some liquid honey, piece of comb. You can see it in there. I have a label that's really thin for these guys so that it doesn't hide too much of the comb, so people can see that when it's on display in the store. And when harvesting the comb, you just need to know what kind of container you're going to put it in. If you're going to put it in this, then you're going to want to, they usually sell cookie cutters that are this size. I got these boxes from Pioneer Plastics, I believe. First time I got them, they shipped it to me for free to Hawaii because they had free shipping and they didn't have the free shipping didn't include Hawaii. The second time I went to ship, they had changed their website. So it was like $100 for a box of 100 of these. They also sell ones that are 8 ounces that are smaller. And then, they also have the plastic kind. I've got these from beekeeping websites. They have these. It's like the soft case, which is considerably cheaper. This is what I put my comb in when I'm selling to catering companies and wholesale and to people that are just like throwing the container away. I have it as an option, or did when I had my honey sold online. I had it as an option for people if you're just buying it for yourself, you can buy these cases, or you can spend a little bit more money if you're giving this as a gift and you want it to look a little bit nicer. Or I've had some people buy them for like wedding favors here in Hawaii. So you can either freeze your comb right off the bat, but if you don't have a chest freezer, then you're probably going to want to put these little things in your in your at-home freezer in your kitchen. And either way works. You just, it's going to be wet, and water is honey's arch nemesis. So I want to make sure that this is sealed well. These boxes are pretty good at keeping the honey inside and not spilling, but then I also shrink wrap them, and I have a sealer and then shrink wrap it. The jars, those are much better at keeping the moisture out. And then if you freeze a frame, you bring it out, you just have to let it sit at room temperature to let the frame dry off. And the honey does not go bad. The honey inside those capped cells, actually, it does not ferment. You just have to make sure it totally dries before you start cutting that up. One person asked, they're on the south end of the island, had my 2 hives for 9 months. The bees have taken all the brood out of the top brood box and transferred them down. The upper box is packed with honey. Can I do a split? You can do a split in a hive if they have at least a minimum of 8 frames of brood. With 8 frames of brood, that leaves you at least 4 frames of brood per hive. And that's a very minimum, especially if you're going to buy a queen and introduce her. Then 4 frames of brood per per hive is sufficient. Ideally, you want a little bit more than that. So if your hive is going to be requeening themselves, it gives them extra time to do all of that and to have enough brood and bee population to be able to handle it. How much honey is in the hive is not relevant here, since there's so many small hive beetles. You really want to take a lot of that honey off if you're going to be splitting a hive, because you really want to make sure that that split, or whatever hive that has a low population and no queen is going to be able to defend all of that honey. Otherwise, insects are going to come in and take advantage of food that is not being watched over, essentially. And that's really it. It doesn't really matter if your bees are in the brood box or in the top box or the lower box or how much honey there is. It really just matters on how much brood you have and whether you have brood to spare and enough brood to spare that they can make an entire hive on their own and survive, that stress. One more thing, if you are going to be harvesting comb honey, you have to be very careful with how much smoke you use, especially during harvest, but really anytime. You can still use smoke, but beeswax is very porous, and so you do not want to use smoke to get bees off of your frame when harvesting. You can use that Be Gone, or I think it's called, it's like that bitter almond oil that you put on the on a rag or one of those fume boards, and that gets the bees out in like 7 minutes. What I do if I'm not harvesting an entire box, I just pick the frame up, give it a good shake over the hive, which gets most of the bees off, and then I take a turkey feather. We have a lot of wild turkeys around here. Not a bee brush, but a feather, a sizable feather, and you just shoo off the rest of the bees. And then I put it into an empty bin or an empty super that is in a trash bag, and so the bees can get back onto it when I pull out the next frame. I have sold entire frames full of comb to a resort here that has a breakfast buffet, and I've had a few people contact me about having a party and just wanting an entire frame of honey on display that people can pull from. So there are displays like that actually will hold your comb like this, and people can just take a spoon and scrape into it, and then it has like a little tray down below to catch all the drippings from the frame, which is something as a beekeeper you can do at very little cost to you, or have it on some kind of dish that's up at an angle so that people can do that. And I think that is it for my comb honey. One person asked, what's your opinion on top bar beehives? I had a couple top bar beehives when I first started beekeeping because they were easier to make and cheaper to make. I had a lot of trouble overwintering my top bar hives. The bees would cluster in the center and go to one end and then starved on the other end. I had trouble with the bees building cross comb when I wouldn't check on them often enough. This wasn't my first few years beekeeping, so I've learned a little bit, and I probably could keep a top bar hive without making as many mistakes. I like the idea of top bar hives, but I always recommend to beginners not to start with a top bar hive. No matter if you like them or if that's something that you want to do later on, I always recommend starting out with some lime straws, just because that is the predominant beekeeping style hive. And when you're getting started, there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of equipment to get. There's a lot of questions you're going to have. And trying to figure out what style beehive you have is not one of those things you need to figure out your first year. And when you have questions and when you need to buy equipment, having a beehive that is not as common is just going to make it harder for you to find those answers. And that's what trouble was that I had. Every time I had a question, people were writing the answer for someone with a Langstroth style hive, and it got really frustrating. So now as a beekeeper, I have a lot more experience, and we had a couple top bar hives on display at the bee farm that I worked at, and it was fun to open that hive. And I think that it's a great style beehive, but I just do not recommend it for beginners. I think it just makes getting started a lot easier, a lot harder, and it's just going to allow for a lot more mistakes. Um, uh, it was like I go to the bee club meetings and I would ask a question and then I would say, "Oh, and I have a top bar," and they would just point me to the one guy at the club that also had a top bar. Like, "Oh, ask that guy." I'm okay, fine. That guy's not that friendly. So anybody else maybe want to take a stab at this? Also, when it came to feeders, I tried a lot of different feeders that I had trouble with. Um, so yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of them. If I was to have another top bar, no doubt I would make it a long Langstroth so that I could put these Langstroth style frames into a top bar. I recommend top bars for people that have difficulty lifting heavy things because beekeeping is not for the weak. Literally, it is. The boxes get heavy. These frames get heavy. I mean, you're looking at 5 to 7 pounds per frame. You have a 10 frame box. It's going to be heavy. And if you cannot lift heavy equipment, you hurt your elbow, you hurt your back, any of those things. When I was pregnant and I wasn't supposed to be lifting things over 35 pounds, it makes things harder. And then you have to find someone to come help you and all that stuff. In those cases, I always recommend top bars. I just tell them that it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find information. And before they buy a top bar, to definitely find somebody with top bars that can help them out before they go buy one, just so that they know that there's places they can go to for information about their style beehive, especially in their climate zone, so they can help them with overwintering and all those things. And then once you have one, maybe you'll love it, or maybe you'll just transfer over to a Langstroth style hive. A lot of beekeepers have a variety of hives. I mean, there's a lot of beekeepers that wanted to get the flow hive as soon as it came out because it was something new and different, or they wanted the Apame hives, or there's all different style hives, and it's different cultures have different hives, so it's I think just a natural part of beekeeping. Once you've nailed down the basic principles, then it's fun to just play around with different stuff, different styles, and try new things. And if you are like me and you like building things, then it's just an excuse to just make something new. I don't really have the time now with the kids, but when I was first building my apiary, I bought a table saw, and I never made my own frames, but I made my top bar hive with my dad. My neighbor came over and told me it looked like a child's coffin. um, I assured him we weren't building a coffin for a child. I didn't have any children at the time, or planned on killing any. And I also then started building my own boxes and lids and bottom boards, and played around with building my own screen bottom boards with hive beetle traps and all that kind of stuff. So once you're more comfortable with beekeeping, all of those things are just like fun toys to play around with. If anyone has any other questions, write them in the comments, or otherwise I'm going to be closing down the live chat. If you have any questions about foundationless beekeeping or if you logged in later and you missed something, feel free to write the questions down. I'm happy to explain something that I already talked about. And then I'm going to have a video out in a few days about determining the cause of death of your hive. And if you're not on the newsletter, then you can go to beekeepingmadesimple.com and click to sign up for the newsletter. So then I send out an email before I go live, a couple days before, and I'll send out an email when new videos and blog posts are up. It's getting close to that time of year when people are going to be getting their bees. So if you have topics that you are finding are really hard to get any information about, let me know. I sometimes forget what the common questions are from beginners. Because I don't do in-person beekeeping classes anymore, so I don't get as many questions from the beginner beekeepers that I used to have. Made it easy to find topics for YouTube videos. One person said, "Do you sell queens?" I don't. I'm in the queen bee breeding capital of the world. The biggest queen breeders are here, plus, everyone else that worked for a queen breeder and now wants to start their own apiary. So I can get a queen bee for, $20. So there's really no point to selling them. I used to sell nukes before my second child was born. That is definitely, if you're looking to make an income beekeeping and you've been doing it a few years, so you have like a pretty good stock, some good bees that deal with varroa pretty well and, aren't too crabby. I highly recommend selling nukes. It's a really good chunk of money that you can get, especially if your hives are just doing well and you don't want any more and you're just doing splits and you need something to do with those bees. You're making, like $200-300. I just buy those $10 wax nuke boxes from Man Lake. Well, I don't know how much they are now. I bought like a case of them, and I give people their nuke in that so that I don't have to deal with people dropping the boxes back off and taking deposits and all that stuff. And it is a really great income, a whole lot easier to make money and faster than selling honey, that's for sure, because honey is a lot of work, the labeling and the jars and all that stuff. You don't make it as much money. One person says, "Do you filter your bottom board oil for the small hybrid, or you just put new oil in?" I do not. I have filtered it. For the apiary I worked for, my boss gave me a bucket and, just like a kitchen kind of um, wire filter, and told me to filter it out. I don't do that because, one, I don't remember to clean them out as often as I should. So by the time I get to them, a lot of them are starting to smell. It's also really humid here. And so the stuff in there can start to get a little moldy. So I just dump it out and put new oil in. That stuff starts to stink. Even when you filter it out, the oil starts to smell. And I have had maybe 1 or